Hello. Today we are speaking with Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, the representative for children and youth in British Columbia. And she leads a team of people at the Office of the Representative for Children and Youth. And she'll tell us more about their mandate and the reports that they release. But today we're going to be focusing on a recent update to a 2024 report called Don't Look Away, and really kind of having a conversation about the importance of family support and early help, and how systems, including education systems, community organizations, and even those around mental health, really need to work together more seamlessly to be able to meet the needs of our children and youth in British Columbia, especially with an emphasis on neurodivergent children and those with learning differences that we serve at Learn, Develop, Succeed. I will also just mention in this intro, for the benefit of our listeners, at Learn, Develop, Succeed, we take a quite expansive definition of the word neurodivergent. So we use it to include all people who have learning or brain-based differences that might have cause a challenge for learning, like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, autism, and other executive function challenges. Jennifer, welcome so much. We're so grateful that you took the time to chat with us this morning.
Yeah, lovely to be here, Rachel. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you tell our listeners just a little bit more about the mandate of your office for those people who aren't that familiar, and then some of your more recent reports, including the update to Don't Look Away?
Great. So the Representative for Your Children and Youth Office is established under statute. So we're legislated to deliver services on behalf of the Legislative Assembly. So we're a nonpartisan independent office of the Legislative Assembly. There are a few of us, like many people will know about ombudsperson or elections commissioners. So there's a few of us that do that, and I'm one. And my focus is threefold from our statute. One is to provide individual advocacy to children, youth, and young adults who are either trying to access services or don't feel like they're getting the services they need from government, primarily in the child and family side of things, or mental health and addiction services, or tuition waiver or post-majority supports like the SAGE program. And then the other areas, we review child injuries and deaths of children who are in care or who have been receiving services from the system, from government systems, in the year prior to their injury or death. So there are about, I think, 7,300 that we reviewed last year. So it's a significant number of young people's stories that we hear. And then the third area, which we're very lucky in BC to have, it's not typical across the country, is to take a look at the patterns that we see in our advocacy and in our reviews and investigations to see what are the systems issues. So that's systemic monitoring and advocacy. So what we do with that volume is we see patterns that we think, the system is not responding in the way that it needs to children. So then we can make recommendations to government on any of those areas and to try and improve the systems. So that's our background, and we're spread throughout the province, about 80 strong. Our largest team is advocacy, of course.
Great. And then one of your reports, originally published in July 2024, was Don't Look Away, which looked at kind of the story of a death of a child in care, but also a lot of the systemic issues and trends around that. And March 31st of this year, 2026, you provided some updates about that, about how are we like reflecting a year and a half or almost 2 years on. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the story originally started with an investigation that we did into a horrific death of a little boy at the age of 11 years. And as we were reaching into, we called him Colby in our story, as we were reaching into the sacred story and trying to understand what was going on, what we saw was recurring patterns that we see for many other children. So key ones were lack of family support and what we call early help, because this was a family that had lots and lots of strengths and lots of precarity. So everything from income and food and housing insecurity to mental health and substance use concerns, intergenerational violence that was not addressed, and the impact of colonization and colonialism on Indigenous peoples. So all of those things were factored in. And so as we were telling the story, we thought we need to not only identify what was going on for this child, but take a deep look at many other children's story and figure out what are the big levers of change that we need to make in order for kids not to be harmed. So the big levers were family support and early help. So before the families start to really crumble, to be able to get in there and stabilize and support. In this case, there were over 40 missed opportunities to do that. This was a little boy that had medical fragility as well as other things going on, but just a really special, sweet little guy who worked really hard to be healthy and positive in his life, and loved school, by the way. School was a very important part of his life, but unfortunately was often disconnected from school by the caregivers. So family support, and then many children in this province, thousands and thousands of children, are being cared for by kin. So grandparents primarily, aunties, uncles, sometimes siblings, and they are being left often without any kind of support. So that was the second thing. The third thing was to address violence, because we are seeing an epidemic of violence, intimate partner and family violence, and that affects a child's whole life trajectory. And the other area was to support accountability, information sharing, coordination, collaboration. And another key area was supporting Indigenous jurisdiction. All of that, though, was wrapped up into a bow to say, our job is not to just focus on waiting for the worst things to happen to kids and then go in with protection. Let's back up and focus on well-being, because we want every child to express their beauty and their strengths and live a good life.
Yeah.
March 31st, what we've been doing is, because there are a lot of reports, I've been around almost 50 years. I've got stacks of reports, and we get excited, we do things, then we forget, and then there's the next horrific tragedy and report. So we've said, we are not looking away. So we call it WANLA. We are not looking away. And every quarter, we bring one of those collective responsibilities and we host a provincial gathering to say, what are we doing? How are we progressing? What's in our sphere of influence? And what could we do better with? So on March 31st, we did that for family support and early help.
Great. I think that's so important to keep these issues alive and keep everybody talking about them at the forefront. And as you say, not wait for the next incident, so that we react to that all the time. Make sure we're keeping our feet to the fire.
That's right.
There's many serious trends and themes here. You use the term epidemic of violence. Can you talk about that more? And I guess I would just add anecdotally that being the leader of a primarily child and youth surveying organization for 7 years, I would say over the last 18 months, I have noticed, and we are growing. So there's,
Yeah.
maybe it's because we're serving more children and youth, but the incidents that we're hearing about and the calls that we're having to make related to violence in families is far disproportionate to the growth that we're experiencing or the number of children and youth that we're serving. And it's, so I would just say, I've noticed that just in our organization, unfortunately. What's this epidemic of violence and where is this coming from? What do we know?
Oof. Well, there's so many different characteristics or are contributing factors, but that it pains me to hear that, but it doesn't surprise me. So here are some of the things that are going on. What we know is in times of economic fragility and economic downturns, we do see an increase because the stress at families increases, especially if there's housing precarity as well. So that's a contributing factor, always has been. And we, of course, we are going through an economically challenging time. The other thing is, and this is something we've been taking a closer look at, is the way in which violence is normalized in online spaces and the prevalence of violence in social media. And that has many different manifestations. Obviously, there's expressions of hate, stigma, discrimination, and then there's the perpetration of violence or the celebration of violence. So there's a contributing factor that I worry about our young people. Online spaces can be wonderful places for connection and belonging, but they can also be pretty dark places. So that's a contributing factor, I think. And then the reality is that we have a very fragmented system with respect to responding to violence. So police have a role, anti-violence workers have a role, protection has a role. But what we saw in Don't Look Away and continues to be the case is there isn't that focused attention that brings everybody together under a common understanding of what it is we need to respond to and how best to do that. So we continue to struggle with a fragmented system, like I'm sure many of your listeners understand fragmented systems. Well, the response to violence is one of those. And that's deeply troubling. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is there's also a tremendous amount of fear because folks who are subject to intimate partner or family violence are fearful of asking for help because they're worried about the protection system becoming involved, children are being removed, and our justice system often puts an unrealistic amount of pressure, primarily on the women, the parent, who's experiencing abuse or violence. And so they often go underground. So there's a constellation of things. It's not one thing, but ultimately the system isn't responding in a coordinated way.
Yeah, it's really troubling. And I know of that in particular children and youth who are some types of neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD can sometimes be disproportionately preyed upon or
Yes.
manipulated in online forums, which is another really troubling overlap or correlation between the people we serve and the likelihood of them being victims of violence or other types of manipulation, whether that's online or in person. So yeah, it's
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think it's important that we understand the continuum too. We shouldn't dismiss at any point in time somebody who's, the bullying behavior or highly disrespectful, stigmatizing, demeaning behaviors, because they're often indications of the perpetrator's struggles in life, but it also has such profound harm. And, you know, long gone should be the days when people say, just suck it up. It's just life. It's not. We don't need to. That's not the kind of society we want. And for kids who might be dealing with other things in their lives, whether it's family stress or struggles at school or not having the friends that they desire, feeling isolated and whatnot, these hit really hard. And as we say, we used to talk about children who witness violence and as if they aren't being really impacted. But what we're saying now is children who observe violence or see it online are experiencing violence that affects them, as you know from your work, is the way in which it lands on our spirit.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to notice though what we might some people might think are smaller things like bullying and
Yes.
harassment or it's part of a trend and it's not okay. We can't have those littler things happening and eroding people's confidence and self-worth and modeling that it's okay to do those types of things
Yes,
basis. So
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about systems, and in this update, I've just written kind of a key takeaway or a summary here about effective support is relational, it's flexible, it's focused on reducing stress for families. And we just talked about that's a preventative thing. If we don't have families who are in stress and the different ways that manifests, so we prevent some of these problems from happening. But your office and their research is feeling that current systems are transactional, fragmented, driven by mandates, eligibility, reporting requirements. And this can really limit the ability of us to build trust and to respond effectively or prevent these things effectively. How do you see that playing out in the education system or the education and where it overlaps with mental health and medical care and things like that for kids with disabilities?
Yeah, that's, first of all, great summary. And I also want to point out we wrote a report called Too Many Left Behind, which was a companion report to Don't Look Away that specifically looked at kids with disabilities and their experience of the system. And the title tells you everything, Too Many Left Behind. And so a couple of things that I want to point out, we are seeing that trend of school exclusions, young people able to participate less and less and less in school, the school exclusions. And there's, again, there's no one thing that's contributing to that, and they're not bad people in the system. It's a system that is not able to be the nimble and flexible and responsive that we need it to be. And it's also a system under strain. So if there are behavioral or developmental challenges that the school isn't able to meet, they're constraining the participation in school, which is, from my perspective, tragic, because those are important developmental opportunities, and so I know the ombudsman person is working on a report right now on school exclusion, so I'm looking
Right.
forward to that. So that is one of the considerations. And then what we see in our work is that uh, young people might be experiencing challenges. Their behavior might not be well supported. Their development might not be well supported within the school systems because there aren't the educational assistance or sufficient hours and whatnot. They experience school exclusion. And then we see often a worsening of mental health conditions, because what do we all need? We all need to have a sense of belonging, purpose, opportunity to be generous and in relationship with people. So we see that vicious cycle, and then the mental health concerns and behavioral concerns reduce the likelihood of reattachment into school and to learning. So then we can see that vicious cycle of young people feeling more and more disenfranchised, and young people need to belong. So they go to places that maybe aren't the safest places for them to be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exclusion. And I guess just for our listeners, if you do feel you or your child have been excluded from school, this happens in small ways too. It's partial exclusions, it's getting sent home in the afternoons, it's being told you can only attend certain times or certain portions of school. All of this has a really hard impact on children and their families. Of course, it also means that families who are relying on incomes of parents are now having to leave jobs and or have more precarious employment or things like that. And it really is got a lot of domino effects for children and their families, and is something we need to really look at seriously. And I know the ombudsperson has been collecting input for quite some time on that, and I also look forward to their report and how we can turn that trend around, different resourcing, different systems in our schools to be able to keep these children and youth included in meaningful ways. Um, I have the social opportunities too, and appropriate social opportunities, as well as the learning opportunities that fit their needs and their where they're at the time. So how do we get out of this fragmentation and lack of coordination to a place that we think it's pretty intuitive to a lot of people that these should be better coordinated, they should be more relational. We should be able to see children especially, but anybody who's in a place of need, and we should be able to rally behind them and be able to lift them up. That just seems like a really fundamental part of having a just and caring society. How do we get there from where it seems like we're in a fairly broken place right now?
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that even when we know the right things to do, we don't necessarily do them. So my journey has been, so what holds us back? What are the
Mhm.
things that get in the way of enabling a more virtuous and just system, a more equitable system, so that, and I think there's some, when we talk about it and Don't Look Away, the mental models are what we call the mindsets. So what kinds of mindsets do we have? We have very siloed mindsets. It's like, this is my job, that's your job. Education is this, social emotional development is that. This is my responsibility. This is not my responsibility. So that's one of those mindsets. The other mindset is that we don't have sufficient resources. Another mindset is everything should be equal. Well, equal means that everybody gets the same thing. Equitable is what we should be aspiring to, because at any point in time, if we even look at our own lives, any one of us, there's going to be times where we need a little more help than at other times. And so I would hope that I would have the opportunity to get the boost that I needed when I needed it in order to be able to, kind of manage I'm a survivor of domestic violence. I needed a lot of help at a period of time. I had a 1 and a 3-year-old, little babies, and 5 years of hell. And I needed a lot of help from a system. I and I was a person with tremendous privilege, but nonetheless, I needed some support. So we have to shift from, well, we can't help this family because if we help this family with a little bit of economic support or housing support or extra respite, then we'd have to give it to everybody. That's another mental model that's really, really problematic. So shifting from that notion of everybody's the same to we need to recognize that everybody's not the same. And that's a beautiful thing. So how are we going to help when people need it? So those mental models actually keep us really stuck. And so what we've tried to do is create more of a rallying cry for something that would get us out of our little silos and into thinking about our broader purpose. So we talk about the North Star of child well-being. So if the education system, the housing system, the income security system, the child welfare system, mental health, etc., if they saw their responsibilities as a collective responsibility to contribute whatever they can to ensure our children are safe, healthy, connected, and thriving, then we might be able to shift the allocation of resources or simply coordinate better so that children get what they need when they need it. And families, because I think this is where we come back to families. We don't want kids to be removed from their families. We want families to be supported to nurture their children. So if it means, you know, uh, you raised a really good example of because of school exclusions or because of the needs that the child has through their life course, sometimes parents need to step away from the workforce. Well, we should be, in my view, we should be saying, well, that's caregiving that we would otherwise be paying for. So let's support families with robust wraparound services and respite, and many of us have talked about some guaranteed income and basic income security so that parents are able to fulfill what they do best for their children, which is nurture and support. So we're trying to say, what have we missed every other time we've tried this? And what are we going to do differently next time? The government is coming forward with a child well-being strategy and an action plan and articulating all the things that the 9 public bodies responsible for some aspect of child and family well-being, what their contributions are going to be. So I'm hoping that that's going to focus our attention a little differently.
Great.
Sorry, long-winded, but that's, these are
Great.
complicated.
Oh, it's very complicated. If there was an easy answer, we probably would have found it already, right? So
Really.
I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for sharing personal experience too. That's meaningful. And I appreciate when people do that to destigmatize the fact that many people have been through really challenging things in the past. And both through my own experience as a survivor of some types of assault and abuse and through the work that I see at Learn, Develop, Succeed. I would also layer on that, when do people need certain help is not necessarily when you might think that they do. It might show up in different times in their lives in different ways. And especially as we work with people across all sorts of, life and developmental cycles, it might not be when you get a diagnosis of autism. It might not be when you get, things might crop up later. It might be during an unmasking period. It might be so I just wanted to normalize that it's okay for people to ask for help or need help at times that we might not have presupposed was the time that they should have help, because we process these things in different ways. And I also find I like your concept of the mindsets. Obviously, we talk about different types of mindsets and framing of how we look at different strengths and stretches of people or issues and how we can put different lenses on them. And I find that, that kind of fixed or siloed, or this is my education is this, academics is this, and social emotional learning is this. And how do we try to bring these together? I think a lot of that comes from resource constraints, that separation, right? Because when people are under stress and they don't have resources of time or money or ability to think in a relaxed way about these things, they get protective and siloed. And I think that creates a lot of problems that are not just directly about the resources, but about how we're managing ourselves in these systems. And we get more insular and siloed and protective, right? Because we're trying to
Yes.
manage such limited time and resources. So it doesn't help us ultimately in making better decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've hit on another key thing is to understand that there's tremendous stressors in the system for the workers. And we wrote two companion reports again to Don't Look Away that took a look at focused in Ministry of Children and Family Development, the stressors there. And what's painful to me, and this is another mindset, is the not only do we see people kind of retreating to this is just my mandate, this is all I can do, this is all I have time for. We also see expressions of burnout often is directed in negative ways towards the people being served. So one of the things we've been really mindful of, and I'm sure that there are many people, your listeners, that have had this experience where um, when the system is under stress, there is a greater tendency towards label, blame, victim blaming, and othering. So we see that with respect to children who are dealing with really complex circumstances, like a constellation of things in their lives. They might have disability, mental health, substance use concerns. They might be in care, fleeing from group homes, all those things going on. And then what we see is instead of seeing those gifts and the beauties or understanding that all behavior comes from somewhere. If a young
Mhm,
person is acting out, figure out the origin story, like what's happened to them. A true trauma-informed approach. Unfortunately, we see systems moving away from children, saying there's nothing more they can do, or they are resistant, they're non-participatory, all these things that place the responsibility back on a child rather
mhm.
than saying, what in the world is going on here? But a system under stress has less capacity to bring that compassion to, which is really troubling to me as well. So and again, we don't want to push kids away. And if we understand that behavior is an expression of something. Much as you said, you never quite know when history is going to come up and cast a shadow over your day or your life in a moment. So understanding that children too are experiencing there might be something that happened a year ago and the shadow is showing up today.
Yeah, we've noticed. We actually wrote a short article on trends in IEP meetings that we've been observing just this past
Oh,
academic year, and a move towards that kind of more labeling, more we don't have the capacity to deal with this. Go figure it
yes.
out. And I'm not doubting that they don't have the capacity and resources to deal with these things, but it's also not fair to unload that onto children and families, and especially on the kids, because
Yeah.
it you know, it we were making, I feel like, and I hope we still do make a lot more move towards strengths-based and neuroaffirming support and care, especially in our education system. But a system under stress does not support that because it doesn't give us the time and space to be compassionate and to ask those bigger questions and allow a child space to explore that themselves because it's not easy to help identify these things. So couple more questions.
Yeah.
Community organizations. So we're a community organization. We're a nonprofit. We work with a lot of other nonprofits who are working in these gaps and cracks and trying to support families in as many ways as we possibly can. How can we be more coordinated, or what's the role of community, or
Mm.
how can
Oh,
we work
yes.
system and work together more effectively?
Yeah, lovely, lovely question. I used to be the executive director of the Federation of Community Social Services of BC, and which is a nonprofit supporting nonprofits and community service organizations. So community service organizations have my, greatest support because there's two things. One is keep innovating, because learn, develop, succeed is such a good example of how you've kind of iterated and evolved and moved into, and even the rebranding and just seeing yourself as how do we be responsive now? So being able to be on the front end of some of those trends and being able to iterate and evolve and innovate is so critically important. Um, and then I think the other key thing is, of course, communications and working together, because there's so much greater strength in the working together than there is in isolation. So and no agency can be all things to all people. So those opportunities for understanding what else is in the ecosystem, in the community, and be able to do those warm handoffs. Having said that, one of the greatest barriers, this is a mindset, of course, of government, is procurement and competition. So we've created, unfortunately, an environment in which agencies are less incentivized to do that kind of collaboration and to build for the long term and iterate and innovate. So I think as a collective of community organizations, it's so important to advocate for multi-year funding if you're getting government funds, for flexibility in your budget so that you can reallocate to address emerging needs. Governments aren't designed to be flexible and nimble. They're not. It's the community organizations that are. And then those procurement practices that incentivize collaboration and cooperation rather than competition, and, one agency trying to get a bigger slice of the pie rather than recognizing each agency brings gifts and strengths. So how do those become together? So I think there's what you do day to day to day. And then there's, I think, the importance of advocating for a different way in which community services get support from government, in order to enhance the likelihood of finding those sweet spots that can really, really be helpful. And I think the other thing too, and this might sound self-serving, but it's not, is if you keep talking about well-being, child well-being, the long term, the North Star, and situating what we're doing, whatever you're doing it is prevention. It is early intervention. It changes the trajectory of people's lives. So being able to tell the stories about why it's important to invest in our kids and in our families and early, before things are really tragically out of control, is so
Yeah.
important.
So much harder to
Yeah,
to intervene and effectively and to support effectively the longer that we let these things go. So yes, early help, early intervention,
yeah,
well-being,
yeah,
absolutely, and expansive well-being. So
yes.
maybe you've just touched on some of these things, but what is giving you hope? What's encouraging you right now?
Well, there's always, I mean, I have the privilege of listening to families and children in my job. And one of the things that it it breaks my heart, but it also is very inspiring, is young people will often say, I know it's not going to get better for me, but I want it better for the children yet to come. My foster brothers and sisters, or my younger siblings, or my friends, or whatever. So that always gives me hope. Is that if young people can have had experiences that have been less than desirable, but are generously sharing, this is what can happen to make it better, then I feel maybe it's hope because there is that spirit, but it's also drive. Let's put it that way, to make to do right by them. Families also, the spirit, the tenacity, the perseverance of so many families. It's like, well, then of course we have to show up as professionals in the field too, right? They can do it, we better do it too. But where I am hopeful is there's a couple of things. One is, a few years ago, actually 2021, we released a report called Sky's Legacy. It was a focus on belonging. And we talked there about how important it was that we create the conditions for young people to feel connected and said belonged, um, and recognizing that systems, unfortunately, systematically unbelong kids. School
Yeah.
exclusion being a good example.
Yeah.
Stigma, discrimination, and if we don't have capacity, we're not going to be able to help, all that kind of stuff. What's interesting is, though, that the language of belonging, we did so much work to get the word, get the concept out there. The language of belonging has started to permeate legislation, regulations, and so I'm thinking, okay, if that happened, we're not the only ones that we're pushing at, but if that has happened and we're starting to see it in legislation and regulations and policies, then can we get well-being into people's consciousness? So we start to think, how is what we're doing enhancing the well-being of children for the long term? So I'm hopeful that government, they know they need to do something. We don't have endless resources. How are we going to work together better? How are we going to lift our kids up and do the early work so we're not doing the extraordinarily, frankly, costly and
Hmm.
heartbreaking work later on? So if we can move that, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm hopeful on that too. And it should make sense from a well-being perspective regardless, but as you've mentioned, it also makes sense from a resourcing perspective. Early help means we don't have to do as much later on help, and it makes more sense for everybody's well-being throughout family systems, communities, and our
Exactly.
whole products. So, and our schools. And I love the bright lights of the things that we see with all of our kids that learn, develop, succeed. There's so much beauty, so much brilliance, so much, success on their own terms. And you talking about the kids who are being advocates for their other kids and other future kids.
Yeah.
That's so admirable, and I just think about the strengths and the brilliance of all of the learners that we serve and the kids that we serve. And we need to listen to that right from the get go. Our kids know these things innately, and we need to not take it out of them. We need to make sure we're feeding their brilliance and their creativity, and that can really thrive and shine throughout their life. So, yeah, I really appreciate all the work that you and your whole team do. Obviously, it's wonderful to have your office in the province and to especially speak to all the systemic issues in addition to all the individual work that you do. So, thank you so much for
Thank
so
you.
many years of service and everything. And I really hope to see more. And thank you for continuing to keep these conversations really live for everybody and to keep us all accountable, government, but everybody. It's critically important that we all do this work together.
Thank you. Well, I'm very appreciative of your organization and the work that you do. And again, I love that you look at the whole child and the strengths and the child within their community and their family is so critically important to have that lens. So grateful for the work that you do.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Take
you so
care.
much for joining us today, Jennifer.
Yes. All the best.
Thanks.